Anyone who looks at me today only sees a fragile old woman. But behind this wrinkled smile hides a child whose innocence was torn away by the hands of those who should have protected her. The deepest scars are those no one can see. My name is Mary Payne, but everyone knows me as Grandma Mary. I'm 87 years old and have carried a secret for over 7 decades that has consumed me from within like a slow poison. I was born and raised in Oak Ridge, a small town in rural Georgia, where the sun rose lazily behind the mountains and set painting the sky with an orange that looked like an artist's painting. It was a simple place with a central square, a white church, and houses with yards that stretched as far as the eye could see. A place where everybody knew everybody else's business, except what truly happened behind closed doors. Our house was slightly removed from the center, on a dirt road that turned to mud on rainy days. It was a simple wooden house with a front porch where my father used to sit after work to drink coffee and watch the world go by. And what a man my father was, my God! Mr. Anthony Payne was a gardener with calloused hands from hard work, but with such a delicate touch that he made the most stubborn flowers bloom as if by miracle. I would really like you to leave a comment saying where you're watching this video from. Knowing that there are people from so many different places listening to me gives me strength to continue this difficult story. If you can leave a like and subscribe to the channel too, that helps me a lot. It's like a virtual hug you're giving me. My father woke up with the chickens, even before the sun appeared. He would wash his face in the aluminum basin in the yard, drink strong black coffee that he made himself so as not to wake my mother, and leave for work whistling softly. He took care of the gardens of wealthy families in town, but the garden he loved most belonged to Mrs. Cecilia, our neighbor in the big house just beyond the curve. Mrs. Cecilia was a widow with no children who treated my father with a respect that not everyone had for a simple gardener back then. "Mr. Anthony, you're not a gardener, you're an artist," she would say, and my father's eyes would shine like stars. He would spend hours in that garden talking to the plants as if they were people, and they responded by growing more beautifully than in any other place. I was 9 years old when everything happened, but I remember every detail as if it were today. Before that, my life was simple but happy. My father made a point of taking me with him whenever he could. "Mary is my special helper," he would say proudly when someone asked what I was doing there. I learned from him the difference between all the flowers, the best time to plant each one, how much water and sun they needed. "Plants are like people, daughter," he taught me. "Each one needs different care to grow strong." My mother, Mrs. Helen, was another story. For as long as I can remember, she had bad days, as my father called them. Days when she wouldn't get out of bed, when she cried for no reason, when she broke things and yelled at the walls. "Your mother is sick in the head, Mary," my father explained to me when I was still too young to understand. "But it's not her fault, and we need to be patient." And he was patient, my God, how patient that man was. On good days, she would even smile, make a delicious pumpkin pie, and even comb my hair and braid it. But these days became increasingly rare. Most of the time, she would sit quietly in a corner with a vacant stare, or she would get irritated over trivial things. Sometimes she would take the money my father kept under the mattress. Hard-earned money he was saving to send me to school in the neighboring town where education was better. "Why does this girl need so much schooling? She'll end up like me anyway, keeping house," she would say, and my father would just bow his head and go work more hours to save it all over again. There were days when she wouldn't even look at me, as if I didn't exist. On others, she watched me like a hawk, as if I might do something wrong at any moment, just like her father, she would mutter with contempt, as if being like my father was the worst thing in the world. But my father, oh, my father was my hero, my safe harbor, my starry sky on dark nights. He carried me on his back when the path was too long for my little legs. He told me stories he made up on the spot before bedtime. He taught me to recognize birds by their songs. "One day you'll fly far away, my daughter," he would say, farther than I ever could. On Sundays, our favorite day, we would wake up early and go fishing in the creek that gave the town its name. We would sit side by side on the bank with our feet dangling in the cool water, sharing a piece of buttered bread that he brought wrapped in a napkin. Those were the best moments of my life, when the world seemed perfect, and I believed nothing bad could happen. My father had a special way of making the simplest things seem magical. When it rained heavily and I was afraid of thunder, he taught me to count the seconds between the lightning and the sound. Each second was 1 mile the storm was away from us, he explained, and that turned into a game that drove away the fear. When I fell and scraped my knee, he would blow on the wound 3 times and say his breath had special healing powers, and I swear the pain would go away immediately. "Mary," he always called me with such affection in his voice that still echoes in my ears today. "Promise your father you'll never lose that sparkle in your eyes, that way of seeing beauty in everything." And I promised, without knowing how difficult that promise would be to keep. My father wasn't an educated man. He barely knew how to write his own name, but he had a wisdom that isn't learned from books. He knew the cycles of the moon, could tell when it was going to rain just by looking at the sky, understood the silent language of plants. "Everything in life has its time, daughter," he taught me. "There's no use trying to rush what needs to ripen slowly." I was an only child, the product of a marriage that, as I understood years later, was never truly happy. My mother married because she got pregnant. My father married out of responsibility. He tried, God knows how he tried to make it work. He brought her flowers even knowing they would end up in the trash. He spoke to her with the patience of a saint even when she treated him as if he were less than human. "Your father is a weakling," my mother would tell me when we were alone. "A man who didn't have the courage to leave this place, to seek something better." I didn't understand how she could say that about someone who worked from sunrise to sunset to make sure we didn't lack for anything. At school, I didn't have many friends. The other children thought my mother was strange, said she was crazy, and ended up keeping their distance from me too. But my father never let me feel alone. "People fear what they don't understand, Mary," he explained to me once when I came home crying because no one wanted to play with me. "But one day they'll see how special you are." He dried my tears with those calloused hands and took me to help in Mrs. Cecilia's garden, where I spent the afternoon learning to make rose cuttings. Mrs. Cecilia also liked me very much. Whenever I went there with my father, she would offer me a glass of milk with cornstarch cookies that she made herself. She would sit with me on the porch and show me books with colorful pictures, teach me new words, tell me stories about when she was young and had traveled to places I didn't even know existed. "This girl has a special light, Mr. Anthony," she would say to my father, who would smile with that pride that only good parents feel. She noticed the problems we had at home. There were days when I arrived there with a bruise on my arm from when my mother grabbed me forcefully, or with dark circles under my eyes from not having slept well because she had spent the night having one of her attacks, screaming and breaking things. Mrs. Cecilia never asked directly, but her concerned eyes said it all. She began to invite me more often, to teach me to read and write better than at school, to show me that there was a world beyond our small life. And so were my first 9 years of life, a constant dance between the light my father brought and the shadow my mother cast. I learning to tread carefully, to read moods, to hide when necessary, and to keep the secrets of our house to myself, because what happened between those walls was our business, my father always said. I didn't need the whole town to know that Thursday morning would be the last time I would see my father leave for work, whistling softly and promising to bring a surprise for me on his return. If I had known, I would have run to him, hugged him with all the strength my skinny little arms allowed, told him how much I loved him. But we never know when it's the last time, do we? Life doesn't warn us when it's about to snatch away what we hold most precious. That morning, the sky was bluer than usual. The cicadas sang as if they were rehearsing for a concert, and there was a perfume of night-blooming jasmine in the air, even though it wasn't time for these flowers to open. Details I only noticed afterward, as if nature was trying to warn me that something important was about to happen. My father left as he did every day, but before going, he stopped at the door, looked back, and smiled at me in a different way. A smile that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world. "Take care of your mother, Mary," were his last words, "and never forget how much your father loves you." I waved carelessly, not knowing those words would be forever etched in my memory as a precious treasure that I would revisit in the darkest moments to come. Because on that same day, everything I knew as life would crumble like a sandcastle at high tide, and the monster that slept inside my mother would finally show its true face. It was on a Thursday in October 1945 that my world turned upside down. I remember the sun was almost setting, painting the sky orange when someone knocked on our door. I was in the kitchen trying to make cornmeal mush the way my father liked it. I wanted to surprise him when he came home from work. My mother was lying down. It had been one of her bad days. When I opened the door, I saw the face of Mr. Juvenal, who worked with my father in the gardens of the big houses. Mr. Juvenal was never a man of many words, but that day he seemed to have swallowed his own tongue. He stood there, hat in hands, turning it between his fingers as if trying to bore a hole through it. "Something happened to your father, girl," he finally said, his voice breaking. At first I didn't understand properly. I thought my father had tripped, hurt his leg, something like that. But when I saw Mr. Juvenal's teary eyes, I realized it was more serious. His heart stopped, Mary. It was very quick. He didn't suffer. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack. The words entered my ears but made no sense in my head. How could my father be dead? My father, who that very morning had given me a kiss on the forehead and promised to bring a surprise. I felt my legs weaken. The floor seemed to have disappeared beneath my feet. I called for my mother, but she didn't answer. I had to go to the bedroom to pull her out of bed. "Mom, Mr. Juvenal is here. It's about Dad." She opened her eyes, irritated at being awakened, and went to the living room, dragging her feet, tying her faded robe around her waist. When Mr. Juvenal told her what had happened, I thought my mother would collapse, that she would scream, cry, despair. But she stood still, looking at him with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't shock. It was as if she were processing complicated information. "And the body?" was the first thing she asked, in a cold voice that gave me chills. "It's at Mrs. Marlene's house. The doctor is still there. They'll bring him home as soon as they can." My mother nodded as if she were receiving news about the weather, not about her husband's death. "You can go, Mr. Juvenal. Thank you for letting us know." And she closed the door in his face. I stood in the middle of the living room, tears streaming down my face without me even noticing. My father was dead. My father, my hero, my protector, my best friend. How would I live without him? Who would take me fishing on Sundays? Who would teach me the names of plants? Who would defend me when my mother had her bad days? "Stop blubbering, girl," my mother said, looking at me with contempt. "You'll have to be strong now. Your father isn't coming back." That night, they brought my father's body to be waked at home, as was the custom at the time. They placed him in the living room, in a simple coffin with a rosary in his crossed hands over his chest. He looked like he was sleeping, but his face no longer had that spark of life that had always enchanted me. It was pale, immobile, like a wax statue that only vaguely resembled my father. People from town began to arrive, neighbors, acquaintances, even people I had never seen before. They brought coffee, bread, cornbread, sat, prayed, told stories about my father. "Mr. Anthony was a good man," they said. "Hard worker, honest, never refused to help anyone." Mrs. Cecilia was among the first to arrive. She hugged me tightly without saying anything, just holding me against her as I cried. That sincere embrace was the only comfort I received that night. Afterward, she approached my mother, who was sitting in a corner, strangely silent. "Helen," I heard Mrs. Cecilia say softly, "if you need anything, I'm here. Anything at all." My mother just nodded without raising her eyes. She seemed to be in another world, as if that wake had nothing to do with her. I spent the entire night sitting next to my father's coffin. I couldn't leave him. It was as if my presence could somehow bring him back. People tried to get me to leave, said I needed to rest, but I refused. It was my last night with my father, and I wasn't going to waste a single minute. From time to time, I would reach out and touch his hand. So cold, so different from those warm hands that had always given me security. I still couldn't believe it. How could someone so full of life simply depart like that, without warning? The next day, they took my father to the cemetery. He was buried in a simple corner under a dogwood tree that, ironically, was in full bloom at that time of year. My father would have found that beautiful. He who loved flowers so much. The priest said a few words, people threw flowers on the coffin, and then they began to throw dirt on it. Each shovelful of earth that fell was like burying a piece of my heart along with it. When we returned home, the silence was deafening. The people had left, taking with them the murmur that somehow made that pain a little less lonely. Now it was just my mother and me in a void that seemed endless. 2 weeks passed in a state of torpor. I dragged myself around the house like a ghost, with no desire to eat, to play, to live. My mother hardly spoke to me. She spent her days locked in her room or sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, staring at nothing with that same vacant look. The neighbors would bring food, ask if we needed anything, but they would soon leave, uncomfortable with the heavy atmosphere that had settled in our house. It was in the 3rd week after my father's death that everything began to change. I was in the yard, looking at the plants that my father had cared for with such affection and that were now beginning to wither, when my mother appeared at the door. She seemed different. There was a strange energy about her, a gleam in her eyes that I had never seen before. "Come here, Mary," she called me with a voice that tried to be sweet, but sounded false to my ears. I obeyed, with that tightness in my chest that I always felt when she used that tone. When I entered the living room, I saw that she had packed all my father's things in a large box, his clothes, his few belongings, even the hat he wore to work. "What are you doing?" I asked, feeling a fear growing inside me. "Cleaning up the house. We don't need these things anymore," she replied, as if she were talking about old junk, not my father's memories. "But Mom, they're Dad's things," I protested, tears already returning to my eyes. "Your father is dead, Mary. Dead and buried, and we have to move on," she said, with a coldness that chilled me to the bone, as if she were announcing she was going to throw away a broken piece of furniture, not the memories of the man who had been her husband for 10 years. When she picked up the box and began to walk outside, I ran after her. "You can't do this. Please, Mom, at least let me keep some of his things." That's when she turned around, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. A deep, visceral hatred. "Enough!" she shouted, dropping the box on the floor with a thud. "Enough of this crying. Your father was a weakling, a useless man who couldn't even save enough money to leave us secure when he died. And now I have to bear the burden of raising you alone." I was paralyzed, her words hitting me like whiplashes. How could she speak that way about my father, about the man who had worked until the last day of his life to give us the best he could? "You can't talk about him like that," I whispered, my voice trembling with anger and pain. That's when I felt the strong slap across my face, catching me so by surprise that I staggered backward. My mother had never hit me like that before. She had her moments of irritation, of shouting, but she had never gone this far. "Don't tell me what I can or cannot do, you ungrateful girl," she vociferated, her eyes bloodshot, her breathing heavy. "Now I'm the one who gives the orders in this house, and you're going to learn to respect me." That night, I locked myself in my room and cried until I had no more tears. I cried for my father, for his absence that hurt like an open wound. I cried for the mother I never really had, for the family that was now shattered forever. And I cried for myself, for the 9-year-old girl who suddenly found herself so alone in the world. In the days that followed, it was as if a monster had taken over my mother. The woman who had previously alternated between good and bad days now seemed to have only terrible days. The shouting became constant, the slaps frequent for anything. If I took too long to do a chore, if the food wasn't the way she wanted, if I mentioned my father's name. "Your father isn't here anymore to spoil you," she would scream, shaking me by the shoulders with such force that my teeth would chatter. "Now you're going to learn to live in the real world." One night, she came home smelling of alcohol. I had never seen my mother drink before. My father didn't allow alcohol in the house. She was staggering, saying things that made no sense, laughing to herself. When she saw me sitting at the table trying to do my homework, she came up to me with unsteady steps. "Look at you," she said, grabbing my chin forcefully, forcing me to look at her. "His face exactly, the same eyes, the same way. You think I don't know he loved you more than me? That he preferred to work his liver out to give you schooling instead of giving me a better life?" I tried to break free, but she only tightened her grip. "I was beautiful, you know. I could have married anyone, could have left this town, but I got stuck here with a man who could barely write his own name and a daughter who only gave me trouble." Her anger was like a poison that spread through the air, suffocating me. I managed to break free and ran to my room, locking the door. I heard when she came after me, pounding on the wood with such force that I thought she would break it down. "Open this door, you ungrateful girl! Open it, or you'll regret it!" I curled up on the bed, my heart beating so hard it felt like it would jump out of my chest. After what seemed like an eternity, the shouting stopped. I heard her footsteps moving away, stumbling down the hallway. Then the thud of her body falling on her bed. Only then did I breathe deeply, silent tears wetting my pillow. That night, as I looked out the window of my room at the starry sky, I prayed for the first time since my father's death. I prayed for strength, for protection, for a miracle that would take me out of that nightmare. What I didn't know was that things could still get much worse. And they did. My mother started locking me in the house when she went out. She said it was so I wouldn't run away, wouldn't do anything stupid. But I think deep down it was so no one would see the marks she left on me, the bruises on my arms from being shaken so much, the split lip from the times when she completely lost control. I stopped going to school. She told people I was sick, that I needed care at home. In reality, she didn't want me to tell anyone what was happening between those walls. "No one will believe you," she threatened me. "They'll say you're a lying, ungrateful girl who wants to harm her own mother." And I believed her. After all, who would listen to a child against an adult's word, especially in a time and place where hitting a child was considered normal, part of raising them? And so I withdrew, shrank, tried to become invisible so as not to provoke her anger. At night, when she finally fell asleep, usually after drinking until she passed out, I would sneak out of my room and go to the kitchen, open the drawer where my father kept his few personal things. Things I managed to hide before my mother threw them away. A small pocket knife he used to cut strings in the garden, a handkerchief that still had his smell, a yellowed photo, the only one we had, taken on the day of my baptism. I would hold these objects against my chest as if I could absorb some of his strength, as if I could feel his presence protecting me, and then I would return to my room, hiding them under the mattress before my mother could discover them. It was on one of those nights, almost 6 months after my father's death, that I began to plan my escape. I realized I couldn't continue living like that. Each day was worse than the previous one. My mother was sinking deeper into alcohol and drugs that a strange man had started bringing to her. There were days when she wouldn't get out of bed, trembling, sweating, yelling at people who weren't there. On others, she had a frantic energy, talked non-stop, made crazy plans, said she would get us out of there, that she would go to the capital, that she would be rich. And on all these days, I bore the brunt. I was the punching bag, the escape valve for all the anger, all the frustration, all the madness that consumed her. I no longer remembered how to smile, how to feel joy. My body was covered with marks, my heart with even deeper scars. I began to save food. A piece of bread here, a piece of fruit there. I gathered the few clothes that still fit me. I took the money I found hidden in a cookie tin in the kitchen, money my mother probably kept to buy more alcohol or drugs. It wasn't much, but maybe it would be enough to take me to the neighboring town where an aunt I barely knew, my father's sister, lived. I planned everything for a Sunday, a day when my mother usually drank more and slept more heavily. I would wait for her to fall asleep, take my things, and leave through my bedroom window that faced the backyard. From there, I would follow the path my father had shown me once, through Mr. Gerald's pasture, until I reached the main road. With luck, I would get a ride with someone who was going to the neighboring town. But fate had other plans for me. On the eve of the day I had planned to escape, my mother came home earlier than usual, and she wasn't alone. She brought with her a man I had never seen before. Tall, thin, with a look that gave me chills as soon as it rested on me. "This is my daughter," she said, introducing me as if I were an object. "Mary, say hello to Mr. Walker. He's going to stay with us for a while." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. There was something predatory in the way that man looked at me, how his tongue passed over his lips as he measured me from head to toe. "Pleasure," I murmured, lowering my eyes to the floor. "The pleasure is all mine, Mary," he replied, in a voice that sounded like the slithering of a snake. "Your mother has told me a lot about you." That night, the shouting was worse than ever, not just from my mother, but from that man as well. I heard the sounds of furniture being dragged, glass breaking, strange laughter, and then silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that left me even more terrified than the shouting. In the middle of the night, when everything seemed quiet, I heard the door to my room slowly open. I pretended to be asleep, my heart beating so hard I was sure it could be heard. I smelled the alcohol and cigarettes before I even felt the weight on the mattress beside me, and then a heavy hand over my mouth. "Quiet," Mr. Walker's voice whispered in my ear. "We don't want to wake your mother, do we?" What happened afterward was so terrible that my mind, to protect itself, erased many details. I remember his weight on top of me, the pain, the paralyzing fear. I remember trying to scream, but his calloused hand covered my mouth with such force that I could barely breathe. I remember the tears streaming down my face, my eyes fixed on the window where I could see a small piece of the starry sky. I thought of my father, thought that if he were alive, none of this would be happening. He would have protected me, would have kept the monsters away. But my father was no longer there, and I was alone with the monsters that had invaded our house. When it was finally over, when he left my room, closing the door silently behind him, I curled up under the covers and cried. I cried until I had no more tears, until my aching body fell into a state of numbness that wasn't quite sleep, but a temporary escape from that unbearable reality. The next day, I could barely walk. My mother didn't seem to notice, or if she noticed, she didn't care. She was too busy with her new friend, laughing loudly in the kitchen while preparing a breakfast that smelled better than anything she had made in the last few months. "Come eat, Mary," she called, as if it were a normal day, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't handed her own daughter over to a predator. I sat at the table, eyes downcast, unable to look at either of them. I felt Mr. Walker's gaze on me, that same predatory look from the night before. I felt nauseous but forced myself to swallow a little coffee so as not to draw attention. "Today you're going to clean the whole house," my mother announced, as if she were giving me good news. "Mr. Walker likes a tidy house, doesn't he, Walker?" He nodded, running his hand through his oily hair. "I do, Helen, and I also like a girl who knows how to obey." The double meaning of those words didn't escape me. Even at just 10 years old, I understood at that moment that the previous night's nightmare hadn't been an isolated event. It was the beginning of something much worse. When they left after breakfast, they said they were going to buy cigarettes. I ran to the yard and vomited everything I had managed to swallow. Then, with trembling legs and my heart beating erratically, I went back inside and went straight to my room. I grabbed the bundle I had already prepared for my escape, put in it the few mementos of my father that I had managed to save, and left through the back. I couldn't wait until Sunday. I couldn't spend another night in that house. Even if I couldn't reach my aunt, even if I had to sleep in the woods, it would be better than staying there waiting for the monster to return. But I didn't even make it to the end of the yard. My mother and Mr. Walker were returning. I saw them turn the corner. I ran back to the house, hid the bundle under the bed, and pretended I was cleaning the room as she had ordered. That was undoubtedly the worst week of my life. Each night brought the same horror, the same despair. During the day, my mother treated me either with complete indifference or with calculated cruelty, forcing me to work until exhaustion, humiliating me in front of Mr. Walker, hitting me for any reason or no reason at all. "You should thank me," she said one night after giving me a slap so hard that my ear was ringing. "Walker likes you. He can get us out of this misery, can take us to the big city, but for that, you have to please him, understand?" I understood perfectly. My own mother was selling me, sacrificing me for what she thought would be a better life. The love she never really felt for me had turned into something much worse, an indifference so deep that it allowed her to close her eyes to her own daughter's suffering. It was on Sunday, the day I had originally planned to escape, that everything came to a head. I was washing clothes in the yard tub, my hands already raw from scrubbing, when I heard shouting coming from inside the house. My mother and Mr. Walker were arguing about something related to money, about him having promised to give her more than he was giving. "You said you would get me out of here," she screamed, her voice slurred by the alcohol she was already consuming early in the day. "Said you had money, that you knew important people." "And you said your daughter was worth it," he replied, his voice cold as ice. "But she's just a whiny brat, can't even do properly what I want." What happened next was so fast that I barely had time to process it. I heard the sound of something breaking, then the sound of a body falling heavily to the floor. Then silence, a heavy silence laden with something terrible. I stood paralyzed in the yard, my heart beating so hard it seemed it would burst. A few minutes later, Mr. Walker came out through the kitchen door. There was blood on his shirt, on his hands. He didn't see me, walked right past me as if I were invisible, and disappeared down the dirt road that ran behind our house. When I finally had the courage to enter, I found my mother lying on the living room floor, a trickle of blood running from her forehead where an open wound showed where she had hit the corner of the table. She was motionless, but breathing. At that moment, something inside me broke. I felt no pity, no fear, nothing but a deep weariness. I was sick of living in that hell, of being treated like an object, of being abused and neglected by the people who should have protected me. I went for my bundle hidden under the bed, returned to the living room, and without looking again at my unconscious mother on the floor, walked to the door. That's when I heard her weak voice, but laden with hatred. "If you leave through that door, never come back." I stopped, my hand already on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see her face. Didn't want to keep this last image of her. "I don't intend to come back," I replied, in a voice that didn't seem like mine, a voice that sounded older, more tired than any 10-year-old child should sound. And then she said something that froze me to the bone. "I'll come after you. I'll find you wherever you go, and when I find you, you'll regret being born." That was the last straw. The little self-control I still had left evaporated. I turned around, confronting her for the first time, seeing her lying on the floor, bleeding, pathetic in her impotent anger. "You're not my mother. My mother died along with my father." The hatred I saw in her eyes at that moment should have frightened me, but it didn't. It was as if I had grown 10 years in those last 6 months, as if I had seen so much horror that nothing else could affect me. I left through the door and began to run. I ran like I had never run before, without looking back, without thinking about anything except putting as much distance as possible between me and that house that had turned into my personal hell. I don't know how long I ran or exactly where I was going. I only know that at some point, exhausted, with my feet bleeding inside my old shoes, I reached Mrs. Cecilia's house. I hadn't planned to go there. My feet seemed to have decided on their own. I knocked on the door with the last remnants of strength left in me, and when she opened, when I saw her kind face transform into horror at seeing me in that state, dirty, hurt, eyes empty from so much crying, I simply collapsed. "Help," was all I managed to say before the world darkened around me. I woke up in a clean, airy room with lace curtains swaying in the gentle breeze coming through the window. For a moment, I thought everything had been a terrible nightmare and that I would find my father coming through the door at any moment. But the pain in my body, the bruises on my skin, brought me back to reality. I wasn't at home. I was at Mrs. Cecilia's house. She came into the room carrying a tray with soup and bread. She had a kind smile on her face, but her eyes showed concern. "You finally woke up," she said, placing the tray on the bedside table. She didn't ask anything, didn't pressure me, just sat on the edge of the bed and held my hand while I ate slowly, each spoonful seeming to weigh a ton. I stayed 3 days without being able to speak properly. I responded only with gestures, nods, monosyllables. It was as if my voice had remained trapped in that house, along with all the parts of me that had been destroyed. Mrs. Cecilia respected my silence. She tended to my wounds, gave me clean clothes, let me sleep as much as I needed. On the 4th day, when the sun was coming through the cracks in the curtain, forming patterns on the wooden floor, I finally managed to speak. The words came haltingly, interrupted by sobs, by moments when the air seemed to disappear from my lungs. I told her about the slaps, the insults, the humiliations. I told her about the man, about what he did to me on those dark nights. I told her about my mother's indifference, about how she knew and allowed it, as if I were nothing more than a bargaining chip. Mrs. Cecilia listened without interrupting. I saw the silent tears rolling down her wrinkled face. I saw how her hands clutched the rosary she always carried with her. When I finished, exhausted, she hugged me in a way I hadn't been hugged in months, with affection, with respect, with genuine protection. "You'll never go back to that house, Mary," she promised, her voice firm despite the tears. Never again. That same day, Mrs. Cecilia called the police. The sheriff came to the house, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and serious eyes. I had to tell everything again, every painful detail, while he took notes in a worn notebook. I saw his face harden when I talked about Mr. Walker. I saw the compassion in his eyes when I spoke of the nights my mother locked me in the room without food as punishment for anything. "We're going to go get your mother and this man," he assured me, adjusting his hat on his head before leaving. "No child deserves to go through what you went through, girl." 2 hours later, we learned they had found my mother, but not Mr. Walker. He had disappeared, probably fled to another town as soon as he realized what he had done. My mother was taken to the police station, screaming and kicking, saying I was a liar, that I was making up stories to harm her. But the bruises on my body told a different story, and when the town doctor examined me and confirmed the abuse, there was no more denying it. My mother was arrested, charged with neglect, mistreatment, and complicity in the abuse I suffered. I later learned that she was sent to a mental hospital in Atlanta, where she was diagnosed with several mental illnesses. I never saw her again. As for Mr. Walker, they never discovered his whereabouts. Sometimes in my nightmares, I still see his face, still smell his cigarette and sweat odor, still hear his voice whispering in my ear. But with time, I learned to wake up from these nightmares and remember that I was safe, that he could never reach me again. Mrs. Cecilia became my legal guardian. It wasn't easy. At that time, a single woman adopting a child was almost unheard of, especially in a small town like Oak Ridge. But she was respected in the community, had money and influence, and most importantly, wanted to give me a home. She fought for me like no one had ever fought before. The adaptation was slow and painful. I had nightmares almost every night, would wake up screaming, cold sweating, thinking I was back in that house, that my mother was hitting me, that Mr. Walker was coming into my room. Mrs. Cecilia never lost patience. She would sit beside me, hold my hand until I calmed down, tell me happy stories until I could sleep again. During the day, the ghosts also pursued me. I was afraid to go out, afraid that people would know what had happened to me, that they would judge me, that they would whisper behind my back. The shame was like a heavy cloak that I carried, even though deep down I knew the fault wasn't mine. Mrs. Cecilia hired a private tutor to teach me at home since I couldn't face school yet. Mrs. Eunice came 3 times a week, taught me English, math, science, and most importantly, treated me like a normal child, not like a poor little thing. Gradually, I began to rebuild myself. I learned to trust again, first in Mrs. Cecilia, then in Mrs. Eunice, then in the gardener who took care of the rose bushes and who had calloused hands like my father, then in the stray dog that Mrs. Cecilia adopted to keep me company. Her house was large, old, full of corners to explore, books to read, stories to discover. It was so different from the small, suffocating house where I had lived with my parents that sometimes it seemed that previous life had happened to someone else, not to me. Mrs. Cecilia never tried to replace my parents. She never asked me to call her mother, never pretended the past didn't exist. On the contrary, she encouraged me to talk about my father, to keep alive the good memories, his teachings about plants, about life. And when the pain for his loss became unbearable, she would simply hug me and say, "Cry as much as you need, Mary. Tears cleanse the soul." About my mother, we talked less, not out of prohibition or taboo, but because the wounds were still too open. With time, Mrs. Cecilia helped me understand that my mother was a sick person, that what she did wasn't out of pure malice, but from a broken mind that never received proper treatment. "That doesn't justify what she did to you," Mrs. Cecilia explained to me one day as we were embroidering together on the porch. "Nothing will ever justify it, but understanding may help you not carry the weight of hatred for the rest of your life." And she was right. It took years, decades even, but eventually I managed not to hate my mother. I didn't forgive her. There are things that go beyond human forgiveness, but I learned not to let hatred for her consume my life, my future. When I turned 12, Mrs. Cecilia asked me if I would like to return to regular school. I was afraid, of course, but something inside me wanted to try. In my child's mind, going back to school was like proving I had survived, that the monsters hadn't won. The first day was terrible. The looks, the whispers, the barely disguised questions. The town was too small for my story not to be known, distorted, amplified in gossip circles. During recess, I stayed alone in a corner of the courtyard, wishing I could disappear. That's when she approached. Lucy, a skinny girl with braids and an easy smile. She sat beside me without ceremony, offered half her sandwich, and began talking about how the math teacher had a mustache that looked like her father's. She didn't ask about my story, didn't treat me like a poor thing, just offered me friendship, simple as that. Lucy became my first real friend. With her, I relearned how to play, to laugh, to be a child. We went to school together, studied together, spent weekends at each other's houses. Her family welcomed me as if I were a daughter, without questions, without judgments. For the first time since my father's death, I felt I belonged somewhere. The years passed, the most superficial wounds healed. I finished elementary school, entered junior high, began to dream of a future. I wanted to be a teacher like Mrs. Eunice. I wanted to make a difference in other children's lives. Mrs. Cecilia supported my dream from the start. "Education is the only thing no one can take from you, Mary," she would say, and invested in it. Books, materials, private lessons when I had difficulty in a subject. She was saving to send me to a good school in the capital when the time came. When I was 15, Mrs. Cecilia fell ill. At first, it was just joint pain, fatigue, things she attributed to her advanced age. But soon it became clear it was something more serious. The town doctor, after many tests, diagnosed an advanced cancer and gave her only a few months to live. It was my turn to take care of her as she had taken care of me. I temporarily left school, dedicated myself entirely to making her last days as comfortable as possible. I would read to her when her eyes were too tired, comb her white hair that was gradually falling out, hold her hand on nights when the pain was too strong to sleep. In her last days, Mrs. Cecilia called me close. She was weak, thin, only a shadow of the strong woman who had rescued me years before. But her eyes still had that special sparkle, that inner strength that had always inspired me. "Mary," she murmured, holding my hand with hers, now cold and translucent. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I replied, tears already blurring my vision. "Promise that you won't let what happened define who you are. Promise that you'll live a full, happy life, that you'll love and let yourself be loved, that you'll follow your dreams." I nodded, unable to speak through the knot forming in my throat. "And most importantly," she continued with a visible effort, "promise that you'll always remember that you are strong, Mary, stronger than all the monsters that tried to break you." I promised, and 3 days later, Mrs. Cecilia departed peacefully in her sleep, leaving an immense void in my life, but also a legacy of love, strength, and resilience that I carry with me to this day. After the funeral, I discovered that Mrs. Cecilia had prepared everything. The house, her possessions, a considerable savings account, everything was left to me. More than that, she had arranged for me to be under the guardianship of her niece, Carmen, a kind young woman who lived in the capital and who came to Oak Ridge only for her aunt's funeral and to meet me. Carmen gave me a choice. I could stay in Oak Ridge, in the house that had been Mrs. Cecilia's, with a housekeeper to look after me until I reached adulthood, or I could go with her to Atlanta, where I would have more educational opportunities. The decision was difficult. Oak Ridge was what I knew, where I had my few friends, where the good and bad memories were rooted. But something inside me, perhaps that same strength that Mrs. Cecilia had seen, pushed me toward a new beginning. I chose Atlanta. At 16, I left small Oak Ridge behind and moved to the big city, a completely different world from everything I knew. The adaptation wasn't easy. The noise, the hustle, the impersonality of the people, everything frightened me. But Carmen was patient, gave me time and space to adjust at my own pace. I finished junior high at a private school, thanks to the money Mrs. Cecilia had left. I didn't make many friends. I still carried that distrust, that fear of getting too close to people. But I dedicated myself to my studies with a determination that surprised even the teachers. When the time came to decide what to do after, I had no doubts. I took the entrance exam for the normal school, as I had always dreamed, to become a teacher. I passed in first place, to Carmen's pride, and, I'm sure, Mrs. Cecilia's, wherever she might be. During the course, something began to change in me. As I learned about child development, about psychology, about how children react to trauma, I began to better understand what had happened to me. I began to realize it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing wrong with me, that I had been a victim of sick and cruel people. This understanding was liberating. It didn't erase the scars, didn't eliminate the nightmares that still visited me occasionally, but it allowed me to look ahead with more clarity, with less weight. I graduated at 19 and soon got a job at an elementary school in the periphery of Atlanta. They were poor children, many with life stories as or more difficult than mine. I saw myself reflected in the frightened looks of some, in the aggressive behaviors of others, in the silent sadness of the quietest ones. And it was there that I found my true vocation. It wasn't just teaching reading and writing. It was being for those children what Mrs. Cecilia had been for me, a safe harbor, a light at the end of the tunnel, someone who believed in them when no one else did. I would return home exhausted every day, but with a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. I was making a difference. I was transforming lives. I was honoring the promise I had made to Mrs. Cecilia to live a full and meaningful life. It was at this school that I met George, the physical education teacher. He was different from any man I had ever known, gentle without being weak, strong without being intimidating, funny without being cruel. The children adored him, and gradually I also began to admire him. Our friendship grew slowly, with mutual respect and genuine interest in each other. He would invite me for coffee after classes, lend me books he thought I would like, make me laugh with his stories about the culinary disasters he starred in. It took me a while to realize I was falling in love, and when I did, fear almost paralyzed me. The ghosts of the past returned with full force. Mr. Walker's rough hands, his alcohol breath, the pain, the disgust, the shame. How could I love someone after all that? How could I trust a man enough to let him get close? I almost ran away, almost asked for a transfer to another school, almost gave up before even trying. But then I remembered the promise I had made to Mrs. Cecilia. To live, to love, to let myself be loved. One autumn afternoon, I told George everything. Sitting on a park bench, the dry leaves falling around us like a golden rain, I opened my heart and my story. I talked about my father, about his death, about my mother, about Mr. Walker, about the abuse. I talked about Mrs. Cecilia, about how she saved me, not just physically, but emotionally. I talked about my fears, my insecurities, about how difficult it was for me to trust, to give myself. George listened to me in respectful silence, without interrupting me. When I finished, exhausted and vulnerable as I had never been with anyone, he simply took my hand and kissed it gently. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this," he said, his eyes teary. "Your story doesn't scare me, Mary. It only makes me admire even more the incredible woman you've become despite everything." At that moment, something healed inside me. Not completely. Some wounds never completely heal, but enough to allow me to take a step forward, to risk, to try. Our courtship was slow, respectful, each step taken with care and consideration. George never pressured me, never demanded more than I was ready to give. When the ghosts appeared, and they appeared frequently at first, he was patient, gave me space, reminded me that I was safe, that he would never hurt me. At 21, I married George in a simple ceremony, just with our closest friends and his family, who welcomed me as a daughter. Carmen was there, of course, radiant to see me finally finding the happiness I deserved. At the altar, as we exchanged vows, I thought of all the people who had been part of my journey until then. I thought of my father with his calloused hands and gentle smile. I thought of Mrs. Cecilia, who taught me what true, unconditional love was. And surprisingly, I even thought of my mother, not with anger or resentment, but with a kind of sad understanding for what could have been and wasn't. Our first year of marriage was one of adaptation, of learning, of discoveries. I had to unlearn fear, had to learn to trust, to open up, to be vulnerable without expecting to be hurt. George was my partner in this process, patient and loving, showing me every day that not all men were like Mr. Walker, that there could be beauty and joy and intimacy. At 23, against all odds and fears, I had our first child, Cecilia, in homage to the woman who saved my life. Holding that little being in my arms, feeling her warmth, seeing her perfect little face, was like a circle closing. There I was, who had suffered so much at the hands of those who should have protected me, now with the sacred responsibility of protecting another life. I swore at that moment that my daughter would never know the kind of pain I knew, that she would grow up surrounded by love, by safety, by joy, that she would know her value, her strength, her importance in the world. 2 years later came Anthony, our second child, named in homage to my father, and our family was complete. George was the father I had dreamed of for my children. Present, affectionate, firm when necessary, but never cruel, never abusive. Life wasn't always easy. We had financial difficulties, health problems, challenges like any family, but we faced everything together, as partners, as friends, as lovers. And in each obstacle overcome, I felt my strength grow, my confidence solidify. I continued teaching, but I also went back to studying. I did a specialization in psychopedagogy, focusing especially on traumatized children. I wanted to give other children what Mrs. Cecilia had given me, a chance to start over, to heal, to grow beyond the scars. At 30, with George's support and using part of the inheritance that Mrs. Cecilia had left, I opened a small support center for child abuse victims. It was a welcoming place where we offered not just therapy and school monitoring, but also love, understanding, hope. I called it Cecilia House, and in the entrance garden, I planted the same roses that my father cared for with such affection. Each child who passed through those doors took a little of me, a little of my father, a little of Mrs. Cecilia. And each smile rebuilt, each nightmare overcome, each future rescued was a victory. Not just for that child, but for me too. The years passed, the children grew up, followed their own paths. George and I grew old together, our love maturing like a good wine, gaining depth, complexity, richness. Cecilia House grew, expanded, became a reference in working with traumatized children. And here I am now at 87, looking back and seeing not just the pain, the suffering, the losses, but also the resilience, the love, the victories. I see a life that, despite having begun in the darkest shadows, found its way to the light. I no longer carry shame. I no longer carry guilt. I carry scars, yes. They are part of who I am, witnesses to what I survived, medals from a war that almost destroyed me but didn't. I woke up in the soft bed of the guest room in Mrs. Cecilia's house, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Relief for being away from that hell that my house had become. Dread because I knew my mother wouldn't give up so easily. She was like a wounded animal now, more dangerous than ever. Mrs. Cecilia entered the room bringing a tray with tea and cookies. I remember how the morning sun illuminated her white hair, giving her an almost angelic appearance. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she placed the tray on the bedside table. "Mary, my dear, we need to talk," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. And then, with a gentleness that I had rarely experienced in life, she explained that she had called the police, that she had told them about the abuse, that a doctor would come to examine me. Panic consumed me, not because I feared they wouldn't believe me, but because I knew what it meant to expose that story. Everyone in town would know. Everyone would look at me and see, not Mary, Mr. Anthony the gardener's daughter, but the abused girl, the poor little thing, the victim. "I can't," I murmured, hugging my knees against my chest. "She'll come after me." "She won't." Mrs. Cecilia held my hands between hers. "Look at me, Mary," she asked firmly. "Your mother can't hurt you anymore, neither she nor anyone else. I won't allow it." There was such certainty in her voice that for a moment I believed her. But fear had roots too deep. "You don't understand," I whispered. "She'll find a way." That same afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange, I heard the shouting. They were outside the house. The unmistakable voice of my mother mixed with other voices, I didn't immediately recognize. Where's my daughter? I want my daughter back. That old woman stole my daughter. I ran to the window and saw the scene that would be etched in my memory forever. My mother, disheveled, with dirty and torn clothes, screaming at Mrs. Cecilia's gate. Next to her was Mr. Walker, holding her by the arm as if fearing she might do something crazy. And in front of the two, barring the entrance, were the sheriff and 2 police officers. "You're under arrest, Mrs. Payne," I heard the sheriff say in a firm voice. "We have serious charges against you and this man." "What charges? Who said that? Was it that old busybody? What did she invent about me?" Mr. Walker, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to escape. He released my mother's arm and turned around, running down the dirt road. One of the officers went after him, while the other held my mother, who was now violently struggling. "Mary!" she shouted, looking at the window where I was. Our eyes met for an instant, and what I saw in hers chilled me to the bone. It wasn't my mother who was there. It was a monster consumed by hatred, by madness, by desperation. "You'll regret this. You'll pay for what you did." I backed away, trembling from head to toe. Mrs. Cecilia appeared beside me, closed the curtain with a firm gesture, and hugged me as I sobbed uncontrollably. "It's over, my dear," she murmured against my hair. "It's over." But it wasn't over, not completely. The days that followed were a whirlwind of depositions, medical exams, visits from social workers, conversations with the judge. For a 10-year-old girl, it was overwhelming. Each time I had to retell what had happened, it was like reliving everything again. The words scratched my throat like shards of glass, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. Mr. Walker was captured trying to board a bus to Atlanta. He denied everything initially, but when confronted with the evidence of the abuse and with testimony from neighbors who had heard the screams, he ended up confessing. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, although at that time, crimes like that rarely resulted in such long sentences. My mother was considered mentally ill after psychiatric evaluation. They diagnosed her with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and several other conditions that I, as a child, could barely pronounce. She was compulsorily committed to a psychiatric hospital in Atlanta, where she would stay for an indefinite period. The judge granted temporary custody to Mrs. Cecilia, to my relief. The idea of going to an orphanage, or, worse, being sent to some distant relative I didn't even know, terrified me. For the first time in months, I could breathe a little more relieved. But peace had a price. The entire town was talking about the case. Wherever I went, I felt the looks, heard the whispers. There she is, the crazy woman's daughter. Poor thing, what they did to her. Wonder if she's marked for life. Mrs. Cecilia noticed my suffering and decided to protect me in the only way she could, by keeping me at home for a time, away from the looks and cruel comments. She hired a private teacher, Mrs. Eunice, a middle-aged lady with kind eyes and infinite patience. 3 times a week, she would come to teach me the subjects I was missing at school. "You're intelligent, Mary," she would tell me when I managed to solve a difficult math problem or read a text without making mistakes. "You have a special light." Those simple words were like balm to my wounded heart. For so long, I had heard that I was worthless, that I was a burden, that I was to blame for my mother's unhappiness. Now someone saw value in me. Mrs. Cecilia also did her part in my recovery. With infinite delicacy, she gradually taught me to trust again, not to startle every time someone raised their voice or made a sudden movement, not to hide when visitors arrived, to look in the mirror and see a girl worthy of love and respect, not the receptacle of shame and guilt that my mother had made me believe I was. One of the best things she did was teach me to take care of the garden. As a gardener's daughter, I already had some notion, but it was with Mrs. Cecilia that I really learned to love plants. There was something deeply therapeutic about plunging my hands into the earth, seeing a seed I planted transform into a flower, caring for something fragile and watching it grow strong. "Plants are like people, Mary," she would tell me, unknowingly repeating my father's words. "Each one needs different care. Some need more sun, others more shade, some like a lot of water, others little, but all, without exception, need love and attention." Gradually, very slowly, I began to rebuild myself. The wounds didn't magically disappear, some would never completely heal, but they began to scar over. The nightmares, which initially visited me every night, became less frequent. The constant fear, that feeling of always being on the edge of an abyss, began to give way to a healthy caution, a discernment that allowed me to differentiate real dangers from ghosts of the past. Almost a year after being taken in by Mrs. Cecilia, I received the news that would change the course of my life. The judge had decided to grant her permanent custody of me. I no longer had to fear being sent away to an unknown place. I could stay there, in that house that had become my refuge, with that woman who, without any obligation, had chosen to love and protect me. "Now it's official," Mrs. Cecilia said, showing me the papers with a radiant smile. "You are my daughter before the law, as you already were in my heart." I cried, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude. I hugged that frail lady who had become my safe harbor and promised myself that one day, when I was an adult, I would do for other children what she was doing for me. On my 11th birthday, Mrs. Cecilia prepared a small party, just the two of us, Mrs. Eunice and Lucy, a girl my age who lived 2 houses down and who, despite knowing my story, had never treated me differently because of it. There was a chocolate cake, my favorite, colorful balloons, and even presents. Simple things, but chosen with such care that they made me feel like the most special person in the world. It was on this day that I decided I wanted to go back to school. I was tired of hiding, of letting fear dictate my life. I wanted to be a normal girl, with friends, with a routine, with dreams beyond the walls of Mrs. Cecilia's house. "Are you sure, my dear?" she asked, concern evident in her kind eyes. "You know the comments might continue, that it might be difficult at first." "I am," I replied, with a firmness that surprised us both. "I can't stay hidden forever. And besides," I added with a small smile, "I have you to come back to at the end of the day." My return to school was exactly as we expected. Difficult. The looks, the whispers, the indiscreet questions, it was all there. But there was also Lucy, who made a point of sitting next to me, including me in games, defending me when the comments became too cruel. And to my surprise, there were other classmates who, after the initial shock, began to treat me normally as if I were just Mary, not the girl from the story. The teacher, a young newly graduated woman named Teresa, was also fundamental in this process. Without making a fuss, without treating me like a poor little thing, she simply ensured that I felt welcome and safe in the classroom. When she noticed the subject was getting too heavy for me, she would subtly redirect the conversation. When she perceived I was having a particularly difficult day, she would find an excuse to have me help her with some task, giving me a purpose, a distraction. The years passed, and with them the more superficial wounds healed. I completed elementary school, entered junior high, began to dream of a future. I wanted to be a teacher, like Mrs. Eunice and Miss Teresa. I wanted to make a difference in other children's lives. Mrs. Cecilia supported my dream from the start. "Education is the only thing no one can take from you, Mary," she would say, and she saved to send me to a good school in the capital when the time came. When I was 15, Mrs. Cecilia fell ill. At first, it was just joint pain, fatigue, things she attributed to her advanced age. But soon it became clear it was something more serious. The town doctor, after many tests, diagnosed an advanced cancer. He gave her only a few months to live. It was my turn to take care of her, as she had taken care of me. I temporarily left school, dedicated myself entirely to making her last days as comfortable as possible. I would read to her when her eyes were too tired, comb her white hair that was gradually falling out, hold her hand on nights when the pain was too strong to sleep. In her last days, with a weak voice, but eyes still full of that special light, Mrs. Cecilia made me promise not to let the past define my future, that I would live fully, that I would seek the happiness I deserved. 2 months before my 16th birthday, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The void she left was immense, a pain different from any I had ever felt. It wasn't the acute, violent pain of the abuse, nor the suffocating despair of losing my father. It was a deep sadness mixed with gratitude, with love, with the certainty that I had been blessed to have had that extraordinary woman in my life, even if for a short time. Mrs. Cecilia's will revealed that she had thought of everything. The house, her possessions, a considerable savings account. Everything was left to me. More than that, she had arranged for me to be under the guardianship of her niece, Carmen, a kind young woman who lived in Atlanta and who came to Oak Ridge only for her aunt's funeral and to meet me. Carmen gave me a choice. I could stay in Oak Ridge, in the house that had been Mrs. Cecilia's, with a housekeeper to look after me until I reached adulthood, or I could go with her to Atlanta, where I would have more educational opportunities. I chose Atlanta. At 16, I left Oak Ridge behind and moved to the big city, a completely different world from everything I knew. Lucy cried when saying goodbye, promising to visit me during vacations. Mrs. Cecilia's house was rented to a young family with the money going to an account in my name to be used when I turned 18. Adapting to life in Atlanta wasn't easy. The noise, the bustle, the impersonality of the people, everything frightened me. But Carmen was patient, gave me time and space to adjust at my own pace. I entered a good school thanks to the money Mrs. Cecilia had left. I didn't make many friends. I still carried that distrust, that fear of getting too close to people. But I dedicated myself to my studies with a determination that surprised even the teachers. It was during this time that I began working part-time at a coffee shop near home. I didn't need the money, since Mrs. Cecilia's inheritance and the rent from the house in Oak Ridge gave me financial security that many girls my age didn't have. But I wanted the experience, the independence, the feeling of building something for myself. The coffee shop belonged to an Italian couple, the Rissos, who had come to America when they were young, fleeing the poverty of post-war Italy. Mrs. Maria, the wife, had a maternal way that reminded me a little of Mrs. Cecilia. Mr. Alberto, the husband, was more reserved, but had a huge heart that he hid behind a tough guy facade. "You have a knack for this, girl," he would say to me when I quickly learned to operate the coffee machine, to serve customers with a smile, to balance several trays at once. "One day, you'll have your own business. You'll see." Those words planted a seed in me. I had never thought of having my own business. I had always imagined I would follow a teaching career. But I realized I enjoyed the coffee shop environment, the fast pace, the contact with customers. I liked seeing the satisfaction on people's faces when I served something delicious, the sensation of creating small moments of happiness amid the busy routine of the big city. When I turned 18, I took the entrance exam for normal school, as I had always dreamed. I passed in first place, to Carmen's pride and, I'm sure, Mrs. Cecilia's, wherever she might be. But I decided to also take a technical course in business administration at night. I wanted to be prepared for any path life presented me. For the next 4 years, I divided my time between studies and work at the coffee shop, which was no longer part-time, but full-time. The Rissos had promoted me to manager, trusting me to open and close the establishment, to deal with suppliers, to train new employees. It was there, at the Rissos coffee shop, that I met George, a young teacher who came every morning before giving his classes. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, no sugar, and a cheese bread. He would sit at the same table by the window, read the newspaper, sometimes grade student papers. Our story began slowly, gradually. First just polite smiles as I served his coffee, then brief comments about the weather, about some news in the newspaper he was reading. One day, he forgot a book on the table, The Little Prince. An old edition with already yellowed pages. I kept it to return the next day. "It's my favorite book," he said when I handed it to him, a smile lighting up his face in a way that made my heart skip a beat. What would become of him always being in danger of being forgotten by a rose? "One must be tamed," I replied without thinking, quoting another passage from the book. His eyes widened in surprise and pleasure. "You've read it many times too?" "It's my favorite." It was the beginning of many conversations about books, about movies, about dreams and fears. George was different from any man I had ever known, gentle without being weak, strong without being intimidating, funny without being cruel. Gradually, without me noticing, the walls I had built around my heart began to show small cracks. It took me a while to realize I was falling in love, and when I did, fear almost paralyzed me. The ghosts of the past returned with full force. Mr. Walker's rough hands, his alcohol breath, the pain, the disgust, the shame. How could I love someone after all that? How could I trust a man enough to let him get close? The first time George invited me out, a simple invitation to see a play, I almost refused. But then I remembered the promise I had made to Mrs. Cecilia. To live, to love, to let myself be loved. Our courtship was slow, respectful, each step taken with care and consideration. George never pressured me, never demanded more than I was ready to give. When the ghosts appeared, and they appeared frequently at first, he was patient, gave me space, reminded me that I was safe, that he would never hurt me. At 21, I married George in a simple ceremony, just with our closest friends and his family, who welcomed me as a daughter. Carmen was there, of course, radiant to see me finally finding the happiness I deserved. At the altar, as we exchanged vows, I thought of all the people who had been part of my journey until then. I thought of my father, with his calloused hands and gentle smile. I thought of Mrs. Cecilia, who taught me what true, unconditional love was. And surprisingly, I even thought of my mother, not with anger or resentment, but with a kind of sad understanding for what could have been and wasn't. Our first year of marriage was one of adaptation, of learning, of discoveries. I had to unlearn fear, had to learn to trust, to open up, to be vulnerable without expecting to be hurt. George was my partner in this process, patient and loving, showing me every day that not all men were like Mr. Walker, that there could be beauty and joy in intimacy. At 23, against all odds and fears, I had our first child, Cecilia, in homage to the woman who saved my life. Holding that little being in my arms, feeling her warmth, seeing her perfect little face, was like a circle closing. There I was, who had suffered so much at the hands of those who should have protected me, now with the sacred responsibility of protecting another life. I swore at that moment that my daughter would never know the kind of pain I knew, that she would grow up surrounded by love, by safety, by joy, that she would know her value, her strength, her importance in the world. 2 years later came Anthony, our second child, named in homage to my father, and our family was complete. George was the father I had dreamed of for my children. Present, affectionate, firm when necessary, but never cruel, never abusive. Life wasn't always easy. We had financial difficulties, health problems, challenges like any family. But we faced everything together, as partners, as friends, as lovers. And in each obstacle overcome, I felt my strength grow, my confidence solidify. I continued teaching, but I also went back to studying. I did a specialization in psychopedagogy, focusing especially on traumatized children. I wanted to give other children what Mrs. Cecilia had given me, a chance to start over, to heal, to grow beyond the scars. At 30, with George's support and using part of the inheritance that Mrs. Cecilia had left, I opened a small support center for child abuse victims. It was a welcoming place where we offered not just therapy and school monitoring, but also love, understanding, hope. I called it Cecilia House, and in the entrance garden, I planted the same roses that my father cared for with such affection. Each child who passed through those doors took a little of me, a little of my father, a little of Mrs. Cecilia, and each smile rebuilt, each nightmare overcome, each future rescued was a victory, not just for that child, but for me too. The years passed, the children grew up, followed their own paths. Cecilia became a lawyer, specializing in children's and youth rights. Anthony followed the path of medicine, becoming a pediatrician, dedicated especially to children who had gone through trauma. George and I grew old together, our love maturing like a good wine, gaining depth, complexity, richness. Cecilia House grew, expanded, became a reference in working with traumatized children. I received awards, recognition, invitations to speak at conferences and universities. But none of that compared to the simple joy of seeing a child who arrived broken, distrustful, hurt, gradually flourishing, finding their voice, recovering their ability to dream. When George passed away at 70, a victim of a sudden stroke, ironically the same cause of my father's death so many years before, I thought I wouldn't bear the pain. It was immense. The void left by his absence seemed impossible to fill. But I had learned throughout a life that wasn't always easy, but immensely rich, that we are stronger than we imagine, that pain, no matter how intense, doesn't completely destroy us if we don't allow it. I continued my work at Cecilia House, now with the help of my children and grandchildren. I continued sharing my story because I realized that in doing so, I gave permission for other people to share their own stories of pain and overcoming. And now, at 87, I look back and see not just the pain, the suffering, the losses, but also the resilience, the love, the victories. I see a life that, despite having begun in the darkest shadows, found its way to the light. I no longer carry shame. I no longer carry guilt. I carry scars. Yes, they are part of who I am, witnesses to what I survived, medals from a war that almost destroyed me but didn't. I could have become bitter, resentful, closed off to the world. I could have allowed the evil done to me to define who I was, who I would be. But I chose another path. I chose to transform pain into purpose. I chose to be for others what Mrs. Cecilia was for me, a light at the end of the tunnel, an extended hand, a chance to start over. Today, when I look into the eyes of my grandchildren, when I see my great-grandchildren running through the garden of the house that George and I built with so much love, I feel a gratitude so deep that I can barely express it in words. Gratitude for having survived. Gratitude for having found people who helped me rebuild not just my life, but my ability to trust, to love, to dream. I still dream of my mother sometimes, not the woman destroyed by mental illness and hatred who pursued me in those last months, but the woman she could have been if she had received help in time, if she had managed to overcome her own demons. I wake from these dreams not with fear or anger, but with a quiet sadness for what could have been and wasn't. I learned many years later that she died in that same psychiatric hospital where she was committed, never having been released. I didn't go to the funeral, not out of resentment, but because at that point she was more a stranger to me than the woman who gave birth to me. But I lit a candle for her, prayed that she had found the peace she never knew in life. As for Mr. Walker, he served only 7 of the 15 years of his sentence, being released for good behavior, something common at that time for that type of crime. He disappeared after that, vanished into the world. For many years, I feared that one day he might find me, hurt me again. But with time, I realized that the real power he had over me wasn't in the possibility of physically finding me, but in the fear I nurtured. And when I let that fear go, it was as if he too had completely disappeared from my life. Funny how life comes full circle, isn't it? The frightened girl who once fled down those dirt roads, bleeding and crying, without knowing where to go, is today a white-haired lady surrounded by love, respected in the community, with a large and united family, with a legacy of hope and healing for the hundreds of children who have passed through Cecilia House over the decades. If I could say something to that frightened girl I once was, I would say that everything will be all right, that it will hurt, and a lot, for a time that will seem endless, that the scars will never completely disappear, but that one day she will look back and see not just the pain, but also the strength, the resilience, the incredible capacity of the human being to rebuild even after the worst devastations. I would also tell her that she will find love, a true, respectful, gentle love, so different from the brutality she knew at the hands of those who should have protected her. That she will have children, and through them, the chance to break the cycle of abuse, to create a new story for her family. That each time she hugs her children, each time she protects them, each time she shows them what true love is, she will be healing not just the future, but also her own past. And perhaps most importantly, I would tell her that one day she will look in the mirror and no longer see a victim, a survivor, but simply a complete woman, valuable, worthy of love and respect, not despite her story, but including every chapter of it, scars that turned into wisdom. What I learned after so many years carrying this story, if there's one thing I've learned in my 87 years of life, it's that suffering alone teaches nothing. It's what we do with it that determines whether it will destroy us or strengthen us. It's the way we face it, how we process it, how we transform it. That makes all the difference. For those watching this video and perhaps going through your own valley of shadows, I'd like to share some lessons that life has taught me. They aren't great revelations. They aren't magic formulas. They're just small truths that I've been collecting along the way, like someone picking wildflowers by the roadside. First lesson: time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them. There are pains that never completely disappear, traumas that stay with us in one form or another for the rest of our lives. But with time, we learn to carry these burdens differently. They become lighter, less invasive, less defining of who we are. Second lesson: forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or justifying. For a long time, I thought that forgiving my mother or Mr. Walker would somehow diminish the gravity of what they did, saying it was all right when it clearly wasn't. But with time, I understood that forgiveness wasn't for them. It was for me. It was letting go of the weight of hatred, anger, resentment that I carried, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Third lesson: we are stronger than we imagine. When I look back and see everything I faced, everything I survived, sometimes I hardly believe that broken and frightened girl and I are the same person. We all have within us a strength that we only discover when we are pushed beyond our limits, when we have no choice but to move forward or completely give up. Fourth lesson: never underestimate the impact of an act of kindness. Mrs. Cecilia had no obligation to take me in, to fight for me, to give me a home and a chance to start over. She did this purely out of compassion, out of a sense of humanity that transcended any duty or responsibility. And this single act of kindness completely changed the course of my life. We never know how many lives we can touch, how many destinies we can alter with a simple gesture of genuine love. Fifth lesson: healing isn't a destination. It's a journey. There isn't a point where we can say, "There, now I'm healed." Healing happens in layers, in cycles, in spirals that sometimes take us back to places we thought we had already overcome. And that's okay. Each turn of the spiral finds us a little stronger, a little wiser, a little kinder to ourselves. Sixth lesson: our story doesn't define us, but it shapes us. For a long time, I tried to run from my past, to pretend that abused girl wasn't me, that terrible story had happened to someone else. But eventually, I understood that accepting my story didn't mean being defeated by it. It meant recognizing its influence on the person I became without allowing it to dictate who I could be. Seventh lesson: family isn't just the one we're born into, but also the one we choose, and that we build throughout life. My blood family failed me in the worst possible way, but I found family in Mrs. Cecilia, in George, in the friends I made along the way, in the children I helped at Cecilia House. Bonds of love, respect, and mutual care are much stronger and more meaningful than mere blood ties. Eighth lesson: helping others heal helps us heal ourselves. Each time I extended a hand to a child who had gone through experiences similar to mine, each time I saw the fear in their eyes gradually replaced by trust and hope, a small part of me also healed. There's powerful magic in transforming our own pain into something that alleviates the pain of others. Ninth lesson: it's possible to love deeply even after being deeply hurt. For a long time, I thought I would never be capable of truly loving or being loved, that I was too broken, too damaged. But love finds a way. It infiltrates through the cracks, fills the empty spaces, illuminates the dark corners. And when we finally allow ourselves to receive it, we discover that our scars don't make us less worthy of love. On the contrary, they are part of the map that brought us here. 10th and final lesson: it's never too late to start over. Each morning is a new opportunity, each breath a new chance. As long as there's life, there's possibility for change, for growth, for transformation. At 10, I thought my life was over when my father died. At 20, when I started working at the coffee shop, I thought I had finally found my path. At 30, when I founded Cecilia House, I felt I was fulfilling my purpose. At 60, when I lost George, I thought I would never find joy again. And here I am at 87, still learning, still growing, still discovering new facets of myself and the world. If this story touched your heart, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. It's very important for me to know that my words are reaching people, that my experience can somehow illuminate the path of someone who is now where I once was. And don't forget what I've learned after so many years carrying this story. Knowing that we're not alone in our struggles, that others have walked through similar valleys and found their way back to the light. That our stories, no matter how painful, can serve as a beacon for someone lost in the darkness. My name is Mary Payne, but everyone knows me as Grandma Mary. I'm 87 years old, and this is my story. Not of victimization, but of victory. Not of destruction, but of reconstruction. Not of despair, but of hope. And if there's something I wish to leave as a legacy, it's the certainty that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes.